Hello and welcome. You're tuned in to Rogue Resistance, a podcast in support of ORD2 Indivisible. I'm your host, Rhonda Nowak, bringing you another segment of Rogue Voices, where local voices push back against the MAGA authoritarian agenda. Fellow Oregonians, I want to tell you that in Donald Trump's America, freedom of the press is about as evident as a fact checker at a MAGA rally. His Department of Justice has stripped away protections for journalists, and Trump's favorite sport, other than cheating at golf, is calling the media fake news. This rhetoric has seeped into our communities, where local journalists are stonewalled, mocked, and sometimes even physically threatened. It's up to us, the people in America who still believe in democracy, to ensure that an independent press remains alive in America. So today, we're digging into how freedom of the press became a punching bag, what this means in Southern Oregon, and why simply binge watching MSNBC won't cut it. I gathered a panel of local journalists who know this fight inside and out. Let's find out who they are and what they have to say about this important topic. I'm Rhonda Nowak. I was a former garden columnist for the Mail Tribune until it folded. And then I was the garden columnist for the Rogue Valley Times. I teach research writing and creative writing at RCC. I guess it was February. I joined ORD2 Indivisible and decided to start up a podcast.
I'm Geoffrey Riley. I am retired now. I spent most of my adult life in journalism, or at least in the room next to journalism, first as a TV reporter, anchor, producer. At the end of my career as a radio talk show host and producer at the JPR, Jefferson Public Radio. In the middle 10 years there, between those two jobs, I also worked in the promotions and advertising. It was good to get back into journalism because there's only so many couches and beers you can sell people and TV shows to get them to watch. It was fun, but journalism is more meaningful and you feel like you're doing something for society. So I'm out of the game, except as a reservist, basically, to come back into JPR as needed. And still very much following the fate of journalism and scared to death about it at the moment.
Yeah, I'm Keegan Van Hook. I'm a regional journalist currently employed with Southern Oregon PBS. My main project is a program I started on YouTube a couple of years ago called Us As We Are that has been incorporated into what I do with Southern Oregon PBS. But last year, I basically spent all of 2024 working on a 6-hour series called Energy Horizons that was about our energy landscape in Oregon and how things in it may change moving into the future.
I'm Bert Etling. I'm the editor of Ashland.News, a nonprofit community news source in Ashland, Oregon. Started in community journalism in 1982 with my hometown weekly and worked for them for a few years, then went into a private business, worked there for a few years, ended up being miserable. And when the opportunity came to go back into journalism with that same community paper as the editor, I jumped at the chance, even though it involved a 20% pay cut. So my career has taken me from that paper to another weekly on the California Central Coast that was part of the then Knight Ridder and later McClatchy Corporation. So I got exposure to nationwide journalism corporations. And then came up to Ashland to edit the Ashland Daily Tidings. The late lamented Daily Tidings was 140-something years in Ashland. And after that went away, was approached by community members who saw the harm that the absence of a newspaper did in a community. And we started Ashland.News. So here we are.
So thanks again to all of you for being here today. This podcast episode focuses on freedom of the press under the Trump administration, with a particular emphasis on local media effects. Also, I think it's important to discuss how journalism has been impacted by technology in general, the internet, social media, AI, and other cultural shifts. Jeff, I want to get a sense of how you have seen journalism and reporting the news change in the last decade or so. How have federal policies altered the environment where you worked, and what local ripple effects have you seen in journalistic practice or public trust?
I'm happy to say that the worst of what is going on happened after I left, but been retired for about a year now. And so it took most of a year before we got this action from first the president and then confirmed by Congress to withdraw Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding, which is a big impact. I got the letter today. It's addressed to my cat because he's actually the person who subscribes to JPR, but explaining that the JPR now has a $525,000 hole in its budget. I believe, don't let me speak too far out of school here, Keegan, but I think that the percentage of the budget is actually greater at SOPBS from CPB. So that lack of money will make a big difference in what our, in my case, former organization is able to do if people don't stand up and increase their contributions. And I've noticed lately, for example, the Grants Pass Daily Courier are coming up with this whole new program where in addition to what you pay for your subscription, you can give $40 a month to be in one category, you can give $50 to be in another category, $60 to be in a different category, but asking for people to support the journalism that they make use of. And I had another conversation a couple of days ago with some people who were invited together by Oregon District 2 Indivisible to talk about what things we people who are out of the game can do to help out the people who are still in the game. And it occurs to me over and over again, one of the major issues is not so much pressures upon our industry from government as it is a situation of demand. If people don't give a rat's ass about local news and don't consume it and don't pay for it, it will cease to exist.
Absolutely. Keegan, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, going off of what Jeff was saying about the CPB funding disappearing, that is 37% of the station I work for's budget, primarily paying for large, big ticket items like broadcast infrastructure. And so when we lose that, and we lose that in a very sudden, short-term way, it definitely impacts on how this organization is functioning. Now, the good news for us is that we're under pretty good leadership here locally at SOPBS. And so we have pretty decent reserves runway that in about 3 years' time, they were able to build on 2 years of reserves. And so that's what our station has to play with right now. We can sort of use that 2 years to look at all the different things that we do and figure out, well, where are we going to have to make cuts? Maybe what things do we actually do more of, move the pieces around on the chessboard, so to speak, to survive. That's been the single biggest change in the time that I've been working here. I'm relatively new to the journalism landscape. This is my 6th year altogether. But the CPB thing, I think for me is the first really big, like titanic shift in how things work, where we're really having to look at budgets and things like that and make some kind of hard decisions about what we do next.
And you have a 2-year period in which to revamp or rethink?
Yeah, roughly. Like I said, the reserve funding would last us 2 years if we continued operating exactly as we always have. And so obviously we're not going to do that. We're going to choose to make maneuvers within that window of time to hopefully, keep ourselves sustainable as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Bert, what about print journalism? What have you seen as far as the impacts go in terms of the Trump administration, the executive orders and FCC investigations, the lawsuits? How has that impacted local news journalism?
I'd have to say not that much. I mean, we're struggling with a technological disruption that goes back 30 years at this point, and that's basically the internet. There's distress in the journalistic community about the settlements that, for instance, CBS reached regarding the 60 Minutes thing, because it's just horseshit. I guess would be the technical term for it. The history of lawsuits and newspapers is long, and the newspapers have long been protected by a Supreme Court decision from the 60s called the Sullivan decision, which Trump is trying to change. And if there's anything that happens there, that'll be a huge impact, but we'll see on that one. Most of those impacts that you ask about in your question are national, or not so much the part of the landscape that I'm involved in with community local news. It's much more, like I was saying, with Google and Facebook taking a huge chunk, billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars out of our revenue streams that we've had to try and figure out. And newspapers close all the time, 2,000 nationally. Just the other day, there were, I think it was 24 or a little more newspapers in the Midwest that went out of business snap overnight. you're done, you're out of here. We don't know if we can pay you.
Yeah, I think it was News Media Group.
Yeah. And that's just emblematic. But what we're trying to do and what Ashland News is trying to do is to use the nonprofit model. We're trying to do like the public radio model of surviving off donations and sponsorships to a lesser extent, and maybe a grant here or there to fund things. And what has happened with Trump is that there's been a realization that this service is endangered, and it's a needed part of the civic infrastructure that's going away. And people are a little panicky about that and are supporting us wonderfully. I mean, Ashland has been great. We're 4 years in. We launched in January 2022, and we've got tremendous support. Our budget and staff has gone up every year, and it's been rewarding that the community has appreciated and felt there's a need for what we're doing.
I feel like it's a different story in Medford. I get the feeling that the Rogue Valley Times is struggling because they're having a hard time getting the readership and the advertising support.
I agree with you. I do think that they're struggling. They've cut staff, and the EO Media sold out to Carpenter, and so they've been swallowed by a national media corporation that's laid people off, fired people. I don't know if a similar model to Ashland News would work in Medford. I just don't know without somebody trying it. They're trying to make that model work that just doesn't anymore. I mean, news was subsidized by capitalism, by people trying to sell mattresses and cars and whatnot. And that was paying basically 80% of the cost of putting out the newspaper and maintaining a healthy news staff. And boom, that 80% is gone. And so now they've cut the subscription part of it, the 20% of revenue, and tried to run the whole operation off of that. And it's just barely workable. I think the staff is basically 3 people in Medford. And we've got a bigger newsroom really than Medford does.
I know you do. So are you seeing the future of local journalism being more like a nonprofit organization type of model?
I think we're almost there. That evolution is still taking place, but there's still something missing. The founding fathers in their wisdom set up the Constitution. They included a post office that heavily subsidized delivery of news. They saw the value of that, the necessity of that for democracy. Some people argued to make it entirely free to mail your newspapers to the public to spread the news, because people need that information to make informed choices to have a democracy. It ended up being a significant subsidy, and they've taken away parts of that in recent years for print papers. But that idea that a community needs, clean water, it needs sewage services, it needs roads, it needs public safety, it also needs public information. And that has been provided through private means for so long. It's just kind of an accident. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. And so we need to rethink how that's delivered. And getting back to the public media part of it, other countries are spending $5, $6 per person per year on their public media. In the U.S., it was like, what, 60 cents?
About $1.60 a person.
$1.60 a person before Trump took that away. So it's ridiculous. It's shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. Keegan, I want to go back to a point that Jeff made a little bit ago, and that was about the supply and demand. If there's no demand for local journalism, then it's not going to be provided. I want to tap into your age group. What do you see as the audience for local news among Gen X, Gen Z, millennials?
Yeah, it's interesting because right now I kind of distribute in 2 different places that have 2 very different audience sets. We still do traditional broadcast television, and I air programs in that form. And I think that's where the majority of my viewers come from, anecdotally speaking, because when I'm approached in public by someone who recognizes me from shows that I've aired, they typically tend to be people who have watched over the air. And that's an older crowd generally. That's like you're 55 and up. It's largely female, it seems. So older crowd on broadcast. And then I get much better, more detailed analytics from what I put out on YouTube. And I still publish all my shows to YouTube as well. And then we also get some statistics from PBS Passport, which is like PBS's online distribution platform. YouTube, I get this much more even spread where basically I have a pretty even percentage of the groups from 35 and up to, 65 and up. It's evenly spread among those. I do know that I have a younger set of viewers. Ironically, no one who's about like in my actual age group. I think most of the people who watch me are about 10 years older than me and beyond, which has been kind of interesting to see. So I've encountered this throughout my short career and all the places I've worked. There does seem to be a thing where it's like older people tend to be more invested in local media. And I wonder if maybe that's because younger people my age and below often are moving around more and are a little bit less attached to where they live a lot of the time. Like when you're in college, I think there are students at SOU, for example, who can probably get through all 4 of those years without really identifying very much as living in Southern Oregon. And then other young people, even if they're after college, there's a sense that people kind of bounce around between places looking for that place where they'll finally settle in. Maybe they're living somewhere temporarily for work and then they're going to move back home, whatever it might be. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it does seem that most of the people I deal with in terms of viewers are older than me, at the youngest, usually in that 35 age group. Probably we're thinking people who are like starting families.
I'd like to add to that the fact that the people who really need a lot of the local news, about kinds of things that Bert talked about. They need clean air. They need clean water. They need information like the fact that their sewer bills could end up huge in Gold Hill because they have to build this long tunnel to connect themselves to Rogue Valley Sewer Services. This is information that's really useful to people who are starting families. And yet these are the people who probably have the least time available because they're raising kids and taking care of their houses and working their jobs and paying their mortgages to pay attention to news. And somehow over the course of recent decades, that whole impulse to go pick up the morning paper or listen to the morning news or watch the morning TV show, and I'm emphasizing the morning because that's where news viewers tend to cluster and broadcast of late, but that muscle just doesn't exist for a couple of generations of people now. And that's, I think, the major issue facing journalism is how to get people to look to local news as a source of stuff that they potentially need, but we hope would want anyway to keep informed. I mean, some of this is boring. I mean, who wants to talk about sewer districts and, geez, my bill could be $150 a month. Well, suddenly it becomes less boring when it starts taking a lot of money out of your pocket. But that's why we're out here, journalists, to try to get that information across. And if we continue down this road where all the stuff that people pay attention to is national and who can scream at each other on cable news over the course of the afternoon, that does not bode well for journalism and its role in a healthy democracy.
I read recently that 64% of Americans under the age of 30 only get their news through YouTube and social media.
The last time I filled in on JPR, the show that comes on before the Jefferson Exchange was a session they had recorded at the Aspen Ideas Institute. And they were talking to somebody who taught journalism. And he was talking to his students about subscribing to the very organizations that they hope to be working for someday. And he asked people around the room, how many people subscribe to Netflix or HBO Max or any of the streaming services? He said every hand went up for at least one of them. He said, how many people subscribe to your local newspaper? And 4 hands went up.
I'll just confirm that that problem exists for Ashland News too. We've got 5,700 subscribers and 70+% of them open their email, which is unheard of, I'm told. But we look at the audience analytics and it says the only bar that's lit up is the 60+ bar. And that's like 90% of our audience, which is wonderful in some ways, but it's horrible in other ways. And it doesn't bode well for our longevity.
I have almost the opposite issue. I'm trying to do this podcast for ORD2 Indivisible, and this is a whole new medium for people who are involved. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, what was said about YouTube and that being where a lot of young people seem to be going for content, it doesn't surprise me at all because I think I fit that bill in a lot of ways. That's probably the place where I go to watch the most. Even stuff that was distributed through normal broadcast means, like I do enjoy watching episodes of Frontline, which is a major PBS program, but I watch those episodes on YouTube because they're available there. In some ways, the success of Us As We Are as a concept was a surprise because when I was initially trying to jumpstart that project, a lot of older people in the local media landscape who I respected were telling me like, it's probably not really going to work. You're not going to get enough appetite locally for people to want to watch these things. But there was a surprise in that because somehow even early videos we made got enough traction that then eventually PBS was like, we'd like to air that stuff. And, it sort of did take on a life of its own. So sometimes I feel like there are unintuitive things that happen in terms of where the audience is and what the sense of the audience appetite is.
Yeah, I think people love the local stories aspect of that show. I really do. Do you think that some of the momentum came from covering the protest rally?
Yeah, I mean, our early videos were topical. Back in those days, we started the whole project in 2020. And that was during the BLM protests and COVID and the Almeda fire. And so that summer we started it up. We did have a pretty compelling story mix where all of that was happening at once. And it created this really interesting, very watchable set of stories. People wanted to know what was going on in terms of COVID response in the state or wildfire recovery, or they wanted to see the sort of human drama that plays out at some of these protests. And in 2020, at that time, those were some of the largest gatherings of people in a protest movement that Southern Oregon had really seen for a very long time. So I think that there was a sense of the stories led to our early momentum. And then hopefully we've been able to do a good job of continuing to find where that interest is and do stories about the things that are the most relevant, or find ways to do stories about national politics, but focus it on how our local area is responding to some of that national scale stuff.
I want to move on to talking about our ranking in terms of U.S. press freedoms. It's pretty depressing. Watchdogs like the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders have documented a dramatic decline in U.S. press freedoms. In May, the U.S. was ranked 57th out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. And this happened right after Trump's Department of Justice revoked legal safeguards protecting journalists from revealing their sources. Factors contributing to the decline in press freedoms include the ongoing economic fragility of journalism, political polarization and public distrust, legal harassment and violence against journalists, and the increasing concentration of media ownership. So, Bert, what do you make of these broad trends, and how do you see them playing out in local journalism?
Well, my concern is self-censorship and anticipatory compliance, that people say, "Well, I don't want the trouble. I'm not going to do that story about DEI or about ICE or something." That would be my concern. I personally at Ashland News don't deal that much with it. I mean, we do to the extent that Southern Oregon University is impacted and that they're having to think about whether or not they should continue their DEI programs or they're going to lose grant funding for that. And we've done stories about the layoffs and all kinds of governmental organizations, national parks and Forest Service and grant funding. I mean, even things like there was a grant to plant more trees in the Almeda fire scar and that got taken away. That's kind of crazy. I mean, why would you not do that? So it's given us a lot to write about in that way. We're not in a situation like CBS where they were trying to sell the company and they didn't want to offend the people that had to decide whether or not the company could be sold and under what terms. So we don't have that hanging over our heads. They can't take any government funding away from us because we don't get any. There's concern in the nonprofit sector about them going after you if you're political. And certainly we're a platform for political speech. We don't advocate ourselves, but we can run letters to the editor and viewpoints from people that do make that choice. I have to give a shout out here to Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart that in the face of that, I can't repeat some of what Jon Stewart did, but it's pretty funny. They're very much biting the hand that feeds them because they're not going to have somebody tell them what they can and cannot bite. That's a fine, proud tradition of Americans. And I just hope that the rest of the country wakes up to this threat to free speech and prior restraint. But that is insidious because it is seeping into this kind of where they're not telling you what you can and cannot do. They're getting you to tell yourself what you can and can't do. And that would be my greatest concern, that people just go to that as a default or an easy position. It's, I don't want any trouble.
I can bounce off a little bit of what Bert was talking about in terms of the self-censoring thing. I think that the added economic problems with journalism right now that are keeping newsrooms small are going to accentuate that even more. Just within the environment that I work in at SOPBS, making us as we are, I'm the only reporter who works for this station. I'm the only person here who does anything like journalism for this station. And so, I get to do a handful of stories a year. I have to choose what they are. And I work with other people to make those decisions, but we're humans. And so in our needing to decide on a very finite set of projects to take on for a year, human elements come into how we make that decision of like, oh, that story is just too complicated for us right now. Oh, that story is a little too big, or we have too many controversial ones. We need some more fun ones. I think every newsroom ultimately has to probably make decisions that are like that in terms of what are the things we're going to focus on and maybe what are some of the things that we're going to have to let fall by the wayside due to resources. But when you're more economically constricted, you've just less people involved. Those decisions all become a lot bigger. I think in Southern Oregon, we're pretty lucky being a community of our size. I think we're decently provided for right now with reporters compared to many other parts of the country. It could be better here, but it's way worse in other places. And I worry about those other places. Like when they get down to making their decisions about what pieces to create, what are they deciding they need to leave out, either based on self-censorship or just a pure lack of resources?
Aside from any particular pressures that are directly put on reporters, there's the whole sense of local officials potentially getting emboldened. And there's plenty of evidence of that too, because of what they see coming out of the White House, where the person at the top says, you're fake news, all you do is tell lies. These are things we used to hear from the far fringes of the political spectrum as reporters out in the field, and now it's very mainstream. And if you read the Grants Pass Daily Courier, as I do every time it comes out, it's like, oh my God, what the Josephine County commissioners do is just kind of ridiculous, where they're constantly telling them they're fake news. The person who chairs the county board of commissioners never talks to the Daily Courier, refuses to, and yet all the commissioners love to go on the right-wing talk show out of Medford. So the sense that maybe it's not a direct pressure in the sense of like, we're going to take away your resources, which of course they did too with public radio and TV, but that we're just going to treat you like the dirt we think you are, and therefore you won't be allowed to get entree to the universe of stuff that affects the people that come out of our branch of government, our particular local level of government.
Jeff's mention of the Grants Pass Daily Courier reminded me of something. His point about changing the character of the conversation and giving permission for people to be hostile, angry, and violent. The Grants Pass, the Daily Courier site has for a long time had on their homepage this video of a local news reporter going to a park to write about something and being assaulted, getting shoved and pushed and having his phone knocked away. And it's a local reporter doing a local story. And it's because of this attitude, the community conversation has shifted to the point where this kind of behavior is, if not acceptable, it's more common. In my career, I've had people graffiti my property and make verbal threats over the phone. I've never been physically assaulted. And I've always kind of taken that, I don't want to say in stride. You never want to take that in stride, but you get callous to it a little bit. But it's gone to a whole nother level. It really has, and it's extremely concerning. I think the FBI said that the most significant terror threat in the U.S. is from right-wing extremists. And that's kind of downplayed because it doesn't play politically with the people that are actually running the FBI at this point.
I graduated from Cal State University Northridge in the late 80s. And that's when I got into newspaper journalism. The first paper I worked on was called the Simi Valley Enterprise in California. I'm telling you, back in the late 80s, early 90s, reporters were kind of local celebrities. And I think it was because we reported on community events and were kind of treated as the community mouthpiece. And so there was really that feeling of being very much appreciated and valued. And then I took a hiatus, got into education, and have been doing that for 25 years. But then when I moved back to Oregon, I got into local journalism again. And, this was 30 years later, and it was a huge difference. Just the lack of feeling valued. never mind a celebrity, but just feeling like, I was credible and professional. But there is no doubt in my mind that people are much more skeptical of journalists today, and they just feel like every journalist is biased. Now, Keegan, you were talking about how you have dealt with some public bias in your positions.
Well, it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of this feeling of like being a small local celebrity, because I do think this is just coming from TV world maybe, but that there has been an element of that. There is also the flip side of that where we do get like this sense of resistance on almost every story we do. And it doesn't really matter so much anymore what the politics of the individual we're dealing with are. There's always this kind of barrier that needs to be worked through in order to establish trust with them. So that's one thing. Then with bias, I mean, right now, PBS is a group that has been targeted a lot with accusations of having a liberal leaning bias. And throughout my time doing the show, my approach to that has changed. I think when I got into it, I had a bit of almost a naive sense of like, I can be Mr. Objective and no bias will ever be a part of it. And as I kind of was learning as I go and exploring the field of journalism, I became more attracted to the idea of that everything implicitly has a little bit of bias. The way to handle that reality is not to just keep telling the audience that we will only give you unbiased news, we'll only give you objective coverage, but be more transparent about your own biases when you make a story. A good example of this is when we did our story a couple of months ago about Josephine County and its libraries and the lease issue that they're going through. That was a story where, I'm a person that worked for PBS, I worked for a nonprofit, I grew up in libraries. There was really no way for me as an individual to approach that story where I wasn't going to have my favorability towards libraries get involved, even though the story was very much about the push and pull of whether a county should fund a library. And so I decided that was an episode where it would be a good idea for me to just say from the start, like, look, I'm a big fan of libraries. There's no getting around it. I like these institutions. I think that they do good stuff for our society. But we're going to do a story today that is about the controversy that surrounds some of the decisions that go into libraries. And then in that story, still do a fair interview with the person who I disagree with. Hopefully, that kind of approach to the bias question will help improve the trustworthiness of the things we create. Because it's giving them that upfront transparency of, look, all right, here's my conceit, here's who I am, and then show them that I can still do a fair job at approaching the story and look at all of the different perspectives that matter to that story, regardless of my bias.
I have a memory of reporting on a story in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, when I was working in Green Bay. And I tried to interview a guy from the Posse Comitatus, which was quite active in Wisconsin at the time. One of those anti-government groups that, paid their bills in silver dollars, taped documents and things like that. And I was just kind of taken aback when I asked him for an interview. And he said, no, because you people lie too damn much. Who would ever think? Well, that has become a mainstream way of thinking, which that alone should be scary enough. I mean, it's good, as Keegan has pointed out, to examine your own biases. I think of all the newsrooms I've worked in and how completely white most of them were, and just some of the things that we used to do because we generally all came from white middle-class backgrounds, and the assumptions that we would start with. So it's been good for us to examine those over the years. But the idea that we go out there in any organization with our conclusion decided, and that any facts that we get are going to match that conclusion is just absolute horse crap. And the fact that it is really hard to shake that, oddly enough, it is made harder still because of the likes of Fox News, who came on the scene saying, we're going to do better than they did because they're the liars. And yet they've become the liars. So, don't trust them because they don't tell the truth. We'll tell you the truth, and yet they don't. I mean, anybody who thinks that, well, no, the news part of Fox News is straight up and down. Nah, look at the stuff that came out of that $787 million settlement with the voting machine company. There was all kinds of crap going on outside of the so-called opinion shows on Fox News. So didn't mean to make this a total Fox News go down the rabbit hole jump. But the fact is that nobody goes into this business because they want to grind an axe, because they don't stay long in the business, because they will be called out on that. The people who just want to find out what's going on and tell the story and understand things about what they cover, like, trees, diameter, breast height. What do these terms mean? What's MMBF? Millions of board feet, stuff like all the things we had to learn to be able to cover the timber industry in Southern Oregon. It's an active mind that is trying to take in and make use of its curiosity and do that on behalf of the public it represents. And for anybody to think that it just comes from this position of like, I am so going to get this guy. I have not seen many people who came in with that attitude in the business, and they didn't last long if they did.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's a thing that I wish I could make more people understand about me when I initially approach them to do a story. Don't understand me as like a political actor. Understand me as a nerd. Like, I'm someone who is very nerdy about this. My overarching interest is that I want to learn about all the different players in some kind of a controversy or conflict and see how they all bounce off of each other, because I think that is fascinating. And that's why I like doing this type of work. And I think that people forget sometimes, like, they see a reporter, guy with microphones, and they go, oh yeah, that's some kind of a political guy. And it's like, whoa. Like, no, that's a nerd. That's someone who really wants to spectate this situation, because it scratches some little like itch in the monkey part of my brain that just is gratified by feeling like I've gained some kind of a top-down perspective. Like I'm an alien from above, like looking down at all the activity going on. That's why I like doing it. I think a lot of reporters can probably relate to that.
I don't think Trump is the first one to call out news organizations for being fake or biased. Trump has just exploited the lack of public trust that I feel has been building up over many years. And he's just done it really systematically and from all different directions.
I think Trump is a master of taking advantage of any perceived weakness. I mean, his whole thing about always punch, always be on offense, never go on defense, never apologize, never back up, never explain. And particularly where it comes to the news media, all of us know what it feels like to have somebody call you an asshole or a jerk or a lying bastard in front of the public, and we don't get to respond. As journalists, it's like, okay, well, thank you, sir. I mean, I have another. Somebody asking Trump on Air Force One a couple of months ago, what do you have to say about so-and-so? And he just looked at him and says, who are you with? And the person says, the Washington Post. He says, you're losing credibility. Next. I mean, there have been people who, in the president's presence, Jim Acosta comes to mind from CNN in the first term, would at least say, what you're saying is not true, sir. But there's this level of respect, and it's a real power mismatch in any of those situations, because as journalists, we're supposed to blend into the background and just kind of observe and then report on what we saw. But the idea that we're going to be able to come back as hard as people come at us, it just is not supposed to happen that way. It's sad sometimes. There are times I'd love to go get the little chain with spikes on it and go swinging after some of the people who said some crap about reporters, but that's not really a good idea. It's not good for the business, I guess.
Yeah. I don't see reporters saying that's not true anymore. Nobody ever questions when he answers a question, no matter if it's a lie or not, there's no follow-up.
Well, who's in the room? You look at the people that are thrown out of the room, like the AP, for not recalling it the Gulf of America from day one.
So he's shut up.
Well, or they're not in the room is my point. They're out of the pool completely.
I'll just jump in and say that framing of everybody's on one side or the other is just like totally alien to journalists. People think because so much of life is transactional and you need to pick sides, and that's what we do as journalists. We're going to tilt the scales to advantage one side or the other. Every journalist that I've known that's a capital J journalist, their North Star is getting it right, is to get the information right. I've had any number of people come after me, even on an economic thing about story decisions about, well, you're writing stories about your big advertisers. It's like, no, that's not the way we do business. And that has nothing to do with Trump. I mean, that's been going on forever. I started as a sports reporter, and I keep going back to that because it's so easy to get your arms around that. You report the facts accurately. You need to get the score right. And if we're writing about elections, we're just writing about this goddamn box score, for Pete's sake. We're reporting. And for people to say that, oh, you're shading the facts, it's BS. We're just trying to get the story right.
Well, we've been talking a lot about how press freedom is being tested in the U.S. right now. And I want to zoom in on two key pieces of legislation. First, at the federal level, we've got the proposed Press Act. And now that's a bipartisan shield law that would make it illegal for the government to force journalists to hand over confidential sources or unpublished materials, except in extreme situations like imminent threats of violence. The House passed it, but it stalled in the Senate. So now we don't have any nationwide protection in place. And under the Trump administration, of course, these press protections are being restricted rather than expanded. And so that's at the federal level. And then here at the state level, we have examples like Oregon's anti-slap law, strategic lawsuit against public participation. And it has to do with meritless cases. They are brought against reporters really as intimidation tactics. And I was very happy to learn that Oregon's anti-slap statute is one of the strongest in the country. It lets defendants quickly strike the cases, recover their attorney's fees, and even halt discovery while the court decides. And then there was an update to that law just last year that added the right to an immediate appeal if the motion to strike is denied. And that makes it even harder for bad faith lawsuits to silence people here in the state of Oregon. But of course, other states don't have these types of anti-slap laws to protect journalists. And so, Bert, given these realities, weak or non-existent federal protections, and then this patchwork of stronger or weaker state laws, what steps would you urge Americans to take to help defend press freedom today?
Well, I would support the legislation and trust your media. This was last year now, I think we had a sheriff in, was it Missouri, that didn't like an article that the newspaper ran. So he went in and took all their materials, their computers and their
Kansas, I think.
Kansas. And to just voice your opinion. I was reading a story earlier today, the aforementioned news media group. What was it, Jeff? Yeah, that the
It is the News Media. Yeah, News Media Inc. Yeah.
There's a town in Montana. This reporter, she had to cancel her immunization appointment, pay a $25 fee for canceling because she couldn't afford it because she wasn't going to get her paycheck. She had dozens of townspeople show up. She lives on this ranch. She looked down the road and there's all these people coming out, which never happens. They came to her house and said, here's some money. We want you to keep getting the paper out. And this was the community support. And this happened in Eugene when the Eugene Weekly had their bookkeeper ran off with all the money. They laid everybody off right before Christmas, but the community responded and supported that. Alternative Weekly, Will Morrison does a great job up there. It's rebounded and is in better shape than ever. So I would just say support your local news.
Certainly in the case of public media, just support public media through the multitude of means we give you to do that. I wish the answer were not just like money, please, but in the capitalist system, that is what it is. We need money in order to do what we do. And so we've been really gratified in the last couple of weeks since the rescission bill and the CPB defunding, how much extra support has come in through membership. And we've gotten a couple of large gifts as well, which has been like incredibly, like, you know, in some cases kind of miraculous how much generosity we've been the recipient of. But the other side of that coin is that we're worried that it's going to be a big spike right now while people are interested and the news is hot. And then a year from now, the interest isn't going to be there as much. We're doing a lot of messaging right now, just trying to tell people, please, if you can, spare us another couple of bucks a month. That could make all the difference for our ability to keep doing what we do at the level that we do. And maybe somehow move into a world where we get to do even a little bit more on the news journalism front.
You know, I think being concerned about your local news organization is a great step, but it goes another step before that, which is caring enough about your community. If you're, for example, somebody who spent your whole career in Michigan and moved to the villages in Florida, how much do you care about what goes on in the county around you? Do you know the name of the county you live in? If, for example, you've moved to the Southern Oregon coast, how much are you going to care about the Brookings Harbor School District if you retired, never had kids in that district, and they're asking for a levy? Caring about your community is really the crux of all of this, and understanding the fact that it is local government that can make the most immediate changes in your life. anything that goes on in Washington, short of defunding public radio and TV, is going to take a while to get to you. But who's going to allow the 4-story housing development to be built next to you? The planning commission and the city council in your town, or the county commissioners. Who's going to decide that your sewer bill is going to go up? Well, the city or the sewer district you live in. I mean, these are the things you are going to end up caring about if they run afoul of you in some way or change your life or cause great expenses to you. So it's important to care about your community first. And then in the process of doing that, support the people who get the information to you about what's going on in that community. Again, this can be some boring ass crap. When I first moved to Medford in 1985 and was reading the Mail Tribune, which was a pretty thick paper back in those days, like, wow, they really cover this town quite thoroughly. Some of this is really dull, but damn, I'm glad somebody's doing this. And over years, as that stuff gets whittled away and it is less and less ability to cover things that will ultimately affect people's lives, maybe not in the near term, but in the far term. I mean, I've noticed all the recalls and stuff in Southern Oregon communities in the time I've lived here. It's like people get mad and then they get involved. If you get informed, perhaps you can get involved before you get mad. So caring about your community, supporting the people who cover it, and therefore having input to both what goes on in the community and who covers it, that's kind of the best of all worlds.
Yeah. I think those are excellent points to make. Think about the information silo that we're all in today, where people tune in to get their news. But it just seems like everything is geared toward your hits on your computer. So you only get the news that has been sort of curated for you. And then, of course, people don't get the whole story. I do see that as one of the major issues that we have in America today in terms of getting the news.
Yeah, I think that's where being a bit of a nerd can come back into play. Something that might help people be a little bit more informed as they navigate the landscape is to try to operate in two truths at the same time. On one hand, you are the activist self. You're the person who has very specific ideas about how you want the future to look and what you want things to be like. And then you're going to use that aspect of yourself to then take action and chase those goals. But your actions will be more effective the better information you have. So that's where then to set the activist truth aside for a while and get into more of, like Bert was a sports reporter, like get into more of an analytical mindset when you interact with the news, where you're not there necessarily to engage with your activist self. You're there to get what the score is and hear what the plays have been and know everything that's going on, know what the arguments of your opponents are, all of this stuff. And then when you do that, you sort of take that information and plug it into your activist self. I think for a lot of people, that's going to help them find out exactly what things they should be doing to make the things that they care about happen or help those causes. And then if they find themselves in an argument, they might have a higher quality argument where they make better points because they already understand a little bit more about the perspective that their opponent is coming from. So I think that two truths model can maybe be helpful for people as they go out into this really complicated world we've got.
You know, the silo thing, it's a real problem. And it's why it's best. Okay, so you've spent your 15 minutes on Facebook. Give 15 minutes to some other news organization that tries to play it straight. You know? Something that won't curate it for you. Go look at Ashland.news. Go look at RV Times. Go look at the Daily Courier. Go look at kdrv.com, ijpr.org. Any place that's trying to cover local news, give them some time. They're probably going to have some national stuff in there too, or go to a national news site. I mean, if you want to look at what's going on in the world generally, I tend to start there with bbc.com. But you have to be willing to go see those things. You have to be willing to take in information that doesn't automatically fit into whatever you set your worldview up to be. I had an amazing and fortunately brief conversation with somebody at the South Medford Fred Meyer, somebody who was complaining about how little time they had to Christmas shop this year because they moved Thanksgiving. I mean, because this window of where the fourth Thursday in November goes, it's going to be from the 22nd to the 28th. And last year it was on the 28th. And there was this woman just clucking away in the pharmacy line at Fred Meyer saying, well, it always used to be earlier. And then this year they moved it. I said, no, since the 1940s, it's been the fourth Thursday in November. And her response was just so classic. She just said, no, And that was the end of the conversation.
Sometimes I feel like when you tell some people what the facts are, they just dig in deeper into what they believed. You're not going to change
Well, yeah, which is an excellent point. I mean, those of us who are trying to keep the box scores and, tally up the numbers, that's a great analogy, Bert. I love that. Still have to accept the fact that some people get more resistant to facts. So this is where it's incumbent upon anybody, activist, Democrat, Republican, journalist, whoever, is like, then ask questions. Explore them and how they got to where they are.
That's something that I want to talk some more about because, yes, you can support your local paper or local news media, subscribe and listen to it, but there's a communication aspect of that too. Not only did people used to read the paper, but they used to talk about the news that was in the paper as well. But I don't think that people know how to talk about current events anymore because they think it's all a big fight.
Yeah, that's a good point. Which one more reason to talk about local stuff? I mean, it's not all a fight, Being under one roof or in one baseball park or whatever, and sharing a space and sharing air and sharing some thoughts. It's something we seem to have lost somehow.
And the issue with the silos is you get guided by algorithms into spending that 15 minutes on Facebook turns into 2 hours and you don't know what happened. And, same thing with YouTube or any other social media. People need to connect with the world that they're actually living in, and that tends to be the local news. So I think it's a consciousness raising kind of thing. We're grabbed by the national headlines and stuff, but if you spend 80% of your news consumption time there, that's only affecting like 10% of your life. It's way out of whack. You're living in the local space, and you need to connect with it. And how do you do that? You do that through the local news. And I think a lot of what we're faced with is as much, and I've talked earlier about this, an economic problem as it is a political problem. I mean, Trump's going to go away at some point, and we're still going to have that economic thing about how do you pay for local news? That's not going to go away. The thing about the attitudes, that's going to change. But actually funding and paying people so they can make a living doing good work in local news, and that's going to continue to be an issue. When the MacArthur Foundation decided to go into this in a fairly big way, $500 million over a few years, I forget now how many years it was. It's not enough. It sounds like a lot, but it's not enough. But the president said that, we support museums and healthcare and all these things, but we've realized that so much depends on journalism. People, they can't help local childcare or affordable housing or the arts if they don't know about it. If you're not reading articles about artists and about engineers and about climate change, then how can you make any kind of decisions or sense of anything that's going on around you? So funding the media is so critical. And I think that people need to understand they've had it so easy for so long with subsidized media through advertising, but that model is broken. We need to come up with the new funding mechanism for local news, community news.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple more quick questions. What do you see as the most necessary skills for journalists graduating today? And how has that maybe changed?
There's certainly technological things. You need to know about various software and programs, but you can learn that. I mean, basically, the two core functions of the job are reporting, going out and finding out stuff, and then writing or producing a segment, whatever your media is, to communicate it effectively and ethically and timely manner. I don't know that that's changed that much. What's changed is the landscape that you're entering into, because is it 65, 70% of journalists have lost their jobs in the last 10 years? It's stunning at how many people don't work in journalism anymore. And if you enter that field, you're coming into a newsroom, it might be a fifth of or a tenth of what it used to be. You don't have as many people to learn from. So it's challenging in that way.
I still have students at RCC who are going into journalism, and I can't help but wonder if they will have jobs when they graduate and what kind of jobs that they have. I've been curious to know, what are they being taught in journalism classes today that will prepare them for the skills that are needed? But I hear you saying, Bert, that it really does go back to just basic writing and reporting, all of those really basic skills?
I went to school for communication, so I wasn't specifically studying journalism per se. I came into journalism from an arts background because my thing was filmmaking in general. And then that sort of found its way into journalism eventually. But I also think there's ways into it where you can be some other type of person and find your way into it. And you really just need to have the assets of caring about the truth, making sure that that's really your North Star, and then just being curious and not necessarily accepting just the surface answer on something. Being the kind of person who wants to dig in a little more and find like the second or third order causes of some particular story. I think just having that genuine curiosity, that's maybe something that can't be as taught. But the landscape has become one where dynamic adventurousness is necessary if you're thinking about making this a career, because a lot of stuff is changing right now. It does feel like the pieces are moving all over the board, and that whatever little niche you might find is only going to last so long. I grapple with this all the time of like, all right, right now it's Southern Oregon PBS and Us As We Are and some of these other projects. But what's it going to be in 5 years? Is any of the stuff that I'm doing right now still going to be what I'm doing in 5 years? I certainly know that I want to be doing creative work and I want to be doing it in the nonfiction documentary journalism space. But I have to maintain a certain attitude of being ready for the adventure, a sense of jump and the net will appear, embracing the uncertainty and making the uncertainty a little bit part of the story, adding that to what I was saying earlier about transparency of your own biases, kind of presenting a little bit about your own characteristics to your audience so that if you do have to move and pivot and do different things with your work, hopefully you can maybe actually carry some of that audience with you and make something sustainable for your career as a big picture. And it might not be as much about putting in decades with one organization anymore. That's just where I kind of sit now, still working for PBS, but seeing a lot of the uncertainty ahead. I think it's going to be quite a lot more jumping around than maybe some have done in the past.
It's interesting. I feel like we have to touch on AI. I mean, it's definitely changing my work at RCC. In 10 years, I wonder if we'll even have English composition classes and creative writing classes anymore. It seems like under this administration, it's deregulating or not regulating it at all. It definitely is going to have major impacts on fields like journalism. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's a tsunami of, what do they call it? Slop. Slop.
There you go. That's a good word.
Our way. It's now a technical term. We dealt with that, mentioning the tidings. The old ashlandtidings.com website got taken over by an AI outfit that would scrape our stories from Ashland News and OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting stories and Oregonian stories, and put it in a AI blender and put it back out on its page. And OPB, Ryan House did a wonderful story about that. And Google changed its algorithm to not send people there as much, which is wonderful. I'm glad they did that. But, the concern there is that it's just corrosive to public trust in the media. There's a story about the healthcare strike, the nurses strike, and they got something wrong. I actually got a call, oh, you need to correct that story. It's not in our story. It was on the Ashland News site. And it's because the AI didn't catch a nuance or a twist or something and they got it wrong. And even if it's right 90% of the time and it's wrong 10% of the time, you don't want to have that for breakfast. I've fallen for some of this clickbait, this stuff, and then I go, this is a total AI article. It's very pedestrian and banal. And they keep getting better.
My concern is that very soon we're not going to be able to tell the difference between something that is AI generated and something that is not.
Yeah, it's good for people to know who's reporting and that there are people in the community. You can know them and see them around and they're at the council meeting or whatever. They exist and they're real and they're covering the news for you. They're not some robot.
Definitely people are going to need to get more attuned to detecting AI slop. I think that's going to be a media literacy skill that's going to be very difficult for people to develop. I think a lot of the time, maybe people on the older end of the spectrum fall for AI stuff that is emerging now. And then people who are younger and a little bit more digital native still are able to recognize it. But when it comes to just how journalists work with AI existing in the landscape, I think it's also a mistake to never use it at all for the benefits that it can give you. Because there are applications for it that are very compelling. It does a very good job as a sort of research assistant So it works as a great information summarizer. Like, I think I know something about this. Here's sort of everything I know about it, but what other information is there? What other things should I be looking out for? And if you instruct it to give you sources on those, it will go do that. The whole process speeds up because prior to those tools, it would have been a much more manual searching process. So it's a tool that can take something that used to take hours and bring it down to minutes while still having you fulfill the basic obligations of checking your sources. I think of it in a lot of ways like a word calculator. I found it to be really useful for certain tasks like program descriptions and titles and things like that. The AI tool has been very useful to take a big paragraph, feed it that and say, could you give me some version of this that's 25 words? And then it spits out something that sometimes it's really good. It's kind of like doing a really big math problem quickly using a mathematical calculator. So there are a bunch of applications like that. But on the end of it, where people just make AI slop, like what Bert was dealing with the Ashland news website, being all AI, I explored that with a lot of interest when it was going on because it was a very local example of that kind of thing occurring. That's going to be something that will take media literacy for people to navigate a landscape where that's really common.
I wonder if they are teaching how to use AI as a research tool like you're talking about in journalism schools today.
I hope so. I haven't done any formal training on how to incorporate AI into journalism. I just been trying to figure out how to use it in a way that seems reasonable. It raises all these interesting philosophical questions that I so love to ponder because I'm an infrastructure, energy, and very much a sci-fi guy as well. So these are fascinating questions.
Oh, so many things. And all of these different things in the world are converging upon the journalism field. And it is going to be very interesting to see where all this takes us, not only in the next 3 years, but even beyond that. Where do you think we'll be in 3 years in terms of journalism?
Oh boy. Hard to say. By the time I was done doing the radio show, I could not imagine how it was done before the internet. And as I hear Keegan talking about some of the work processes he has to go through, there are going to be people probably now who would say, I don't know how to do this without AI. So the tools keep coming in, but as Bert referred to before, the essence of the job has remained the same, which is find out what's going on, accurately tell the story. It's that simple. But the question for the industry now in America is figure out how to keep it going, both in keeping the organizations that provide journalism alive and making sure that people make use of what those organizations put out and trust it.
Yeah. Well, press freedoms are certainly a very important part of our democracy in America. And I just do not see how we can continue to have a strong democracy without having a strong independent press.
Well, yeah, if people don't know what the hell they're talking about, how can they effectively participate in society?
Yeah. Well, thank you, all three of you, for spending time with me today. I really appreciate you, and I very much appreciate the work that you're doing now, the work that you've done in the past. Are you enjoying your retirement, Jeff?
Oh my God, yes. I had to remember it was Tuesday when we did this.
And Bert, what are your plans?
We'll see. Be around for a little bit longer. I love the work that I'm doing and the impact I can see it have on the community and to make the world around me a better place. I take pride and joy in that. These are interesting times we're living in. Never a dull moment.
That's for sure. And I hear from you, Keegan, that you're keeping your options open and seeing this all as a big adventure. I love that.
Yeah, that's what all of life is. That's been my way of understanding how to move through the world for a while. Every day is an adventure. And right now I've got a great job where I basically get paid to go on field trips. So I'm very happy. I'm having fun despite the crazy times we're living through. Somehow I keep finding reasons to enjoy myself. And I think that's important to do. If you're not having a good time doing what you do, you're not going to do a good job of it. I love being a regional journalist. I identify very strongly with that label. So I'll be here. And I have another slate of shows starting in September. So if people are curious to see what I've been working on throughout the summer, that will be the opportunity to do that. I think I've got 7 new shows coming up. which is
Oh,
Well,
crazy. I have a lot of editing to
wow.
do.
Wow, you've been busy.
I am busy. Yeah. I'm going to be here pretty late tonight, just editing away. I've got the Attorney General Dan Rayfield on the plate right now. I'm going to get a YouTube video of that made and then incorporate that into a larger program about regional politics throughout the summer. And then, yeah, like this huge list of other shows that I'm editing. We did a show about the subculture of paragliding in the Applegate Valley, and that'll be airing in this upcoming set of shows.
Nice to see it. Well, thanks again, all of you. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having
glad
me.
to do it.
So, folks, that wraps up our panel discussion on the state of the press. Journalism in America is broke, battered, but still breathing. Here's the thing. We're not powerless. Oregon has strong anti-SLAPP laws, and communities like ours can work together to keep the lights on in the press room. If you care about democracy and an independent press, do something proactive. Subscribe to the Rogue Valley Times or the Grants Pass Daily Courier. Give a donation to Jefferson Public Radio, Southern Oregon PBS, or the nonprofit Ashland News. These are the folks telling our stories. Without them, we become an uninformed news desert. Press freedom isn't going to save itself, but with a few clicks, a few bucks, and a little backbone, we can make damn sure Southern Oregon still has a free press worth fighting for. Thanks for listening to Rogue Resistance and this segment of Rogue Voices, where we amplify local voices pushing back against the MAGA agenda. Support our video podcast by subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, posting a comment, and sharing the link on your social media. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay indivisible.